It was the kind of moment no chronicler dared to describe in full detail, when the battlefield had already gone silent, yet the real story was only beginning. Knights in battered armor standing under gray European skies with their visors lifted, realizing the war had not ended for them because they were not being killed, they were being taken. What happened next was never fully written in any royal record, and even the surviving accounts of the Hundred Years' War leave a strange silence exactly where their fate should be. In the years between 1337 and 1453, across fractured kingdoms of England and France, war did not only decide who won or lost territory, it also created a hidden system that determined what became of the most valuable men once their banners had fallen. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were knights, trained from childhood, armored in steel, bound by codes of honor that promised glory on the field. Yet what followed capture revealed a very different reality beneath the legend. When a knight was unhorsed and surrounded, there was often no final dramatic moment, no heroic last stand, only the sudden shift from combat to stillness, from movement to control, as hands that once held swords were bound and guided away from the field. The armies of medieval Europe had learned that killing such men was often a waste, because their true value did not end with their defeat, it began with it. Behind the front lines, a quieter system existed, one built on negotiation, lineage, and obligation, where names mattered more than weapons, and family crests could decide whether a man would live in confinement or be exchanged like a piece of currency between rival lords. Few people today realize how organized this system had become during the Hundred Years' War, where noble captives were not simply imprisoned in the way modern history might assume, but instead entered a world of controlled detention inside stone fortresses, isolated towers, or guarded estates where time itself seemed to slow down. Some were held for months, others for years, their freedom suspended while messages crossed battle lines, carrying demands measured in gold, land, or political favor. Yet what makes this period so unusual is not just the system itself, but the uncertainty surrounding it, because records often end abruptly, leaving gaps where entire individuals seem to vanish from documentation without explanation. In certain cases, a knight's name appears in a battlefield account and then never appears again, not in death rolls, not in ransom lists, not in release records, as if they were removed from the historical narrative altogether. This is where the story becomes less about warfare and more about disappearance, about what happens when a structured system of honor collides with the chaos of prolonged conflict, and when the value of a man becomes less about his survival and more about his usefulness to those who control his fate. What you are about to hear is not the story of how battles were won or lost, but the overlooked reality of what happened in the space between capture and silence, a space where history becomes unclear, and where the truth, according to many fragmented accounts, may be far more complex than anything recorded in official chronicles. The moment a knight was taken from the field, his identity did not simply end. It transformed into something entirely different within the structure of medieval warfare, where the aftermath of conflict was governed by rules that were never written in any single law, but were understood across the noble class of Europe. After capture, these men were typically separated not by cruelty, but by rank, lineage, and perceived political value, as messengers and officers moved quickly to identify who they were dealing with, often referencing heraldic symbols, testimonies from other captives, or knowledge carried from earlier encounters between noble houses. In the early stages of the Hundred Years' War, particularly during the mid-14th century, this process became increasingly formalized, as both English and French forces realized that a captured knight represented more than a defeated enemy. He represented leverage, influence, and in many cases, a form of wealth that could shift the balance of smaller regional conflicts. Once identified, these individuals were escorted away from the immediate theater of operations, not into chaotic confinement, but into controlled environments that reflected their social standing, often within fortified residences, converted towers, or designated chambers inside castles that had been adapted for long-term holding. Within these spaces, time lost its normal meaning, as communication between captor and captive began to define the rhythm of daily life, with negotiations traveling through layers of intermediaries, including heralds, scribes, and trusted envoys who carried sealed messages across contested territories. What is often overlooked in modern understanding is that these negotiations were not always immediate or efficient, and in many cases, they stretched across seasons, influenced by shifting alliances, changing fortunes on distant battlefields, and the financial capacity of families who were responsible for securing release. During this period, a captured knight might find himself in a strange position of relative safety but complete uncertainty, where physical conditions were stable but psychological pressure came from isolation and the awareness that his fate depended on factors entirely outside his control. Meanwhile, across Europe, a parallel system of valuation developed, where lists of noble captives were maintained with careful attention to titles, land holdings, and strategic importance, effectively turning human lives into entries within a broader political ledger that dictated terms of exchange. This system was not uniform, as regional customs varied significantly between England, France, and the smaller principalities caught between them. Yet the underlying principle remained consistent, which was that nobility carried a price, and that price could be negotiated, delayed, or leveraged depending on the needs of those holding authority. In some cases, captives were visited by representatives of their own allies, who assessed their condition and relayed information back to their families, reinforcing the reality that survival alone was not the end goal, but rather the beginning of a prolonged period of uncertainty, shaped by diplomacy rather than combat. It was within this hidden framework that many knights experienced a form of existence that stood in stark contrast to their expectations of warfare, where honor on the battlefield gave way to patience in confinement, and where the outcome of their lives was determined less by strength or skill, and more by negotiation, timing, and political necessity. Yet even within this structured system, there were inconsistencies and gaps, moments where records become incomplete, where individuals are mentioned once and then never again, leaving behind questions that historians still struggle to answer, and setting the stage for deeper mysteries surrounding what truly happened to those who entered captivity during one of the longest and most complex conflicts in medieval European history. As the system of noble captivity continued to evolve across the decades of the Hundred Years' War, what began as an improvised practice gradually hardened into a recognizable structure that shaped the fate of captured knights in ways most battlefield accounts never fully explained. Once a captive had been relocated into a controlled residence, his daily existence became governed by routines that were deceptively ordinary on the surface, yet deeply strategic in purpose, as guards and administrators maintained careful oversight not only of movement, but also of communication, ensuring that every message leaving the holding site passed through official hands. Letters were written, reviewed, copied, and forwarded along established channels, often taking weeks or even months to reach their destination, creating a slow rhythm of anticipation that defined the psychological landscape of captivity more than any physical constraint. Within this environment, knights were not treated as anonymous prisoners, but as individuals whose identities carried weight, and this meant their treatment often reflected their family reputation, their allegiance in the war, and their potential usefulness in future negotiations. Some were allowed limited interactions with attendants or clerks, who recorded details of their condition and maintained inventories that would later be used to justify ransom demands, while others were kept in more restricted quarters, depending on the sensitivity of their capture. Across both English and French-controlled territories, a shared understanding emerged that time itself was a tool of pressure, and the longer a knight remained in captivity, the more complex the negotiations became, as financial obligations, political alliances, and shifting military fortunes all influenced whether release was possible or indefinitely delayed. In many cases, entire communities became involved in the process, as families pooled resources, sold property, or appealed to patrons in order to secure the return of a captured relative, turning individual captivity into a matter of broader economic consequence. Yet, despite this structured system, there remained an underlying fragility in the record-keeping of the period, where documentation could be incomplete, duplicated, or lost entirely during transitions between regions or during periods of intensified conflict, leaving behind gaps that later historians would struggle to reconcile. These gaps are particularly significant when examining the fate of certain knights whose names appear briefly in correspondence or administrative lists and then disappear without explanation, creating a pattern of absence that suggests not only administrative failure, but also the limitations of medieval record systems under prolonged strain. It is within these omissions that the historical narrative becomes most uncertain, as the absence of information forces reliance on inference rather than confirmation, and opens the possibility that captivity did not always follow the structured path described in surviving accounts. While some knights eventually re-emerged after years of negotiation, returning to their estates altered by time and political change, Others remain unaccounted for, their final outcomes obscured by the fragmented nature of surviving sources. This uneven preservation of information has led scholars to recognize that the experience of captivity during the Hundred Years' War cannot be understood solely through documented cases, but must also account for the silent spaces between records, where the fate of individuals fades into ambiguity, and the structured system of ransom and negotiation reveals its most unpredictable dimension. As the system of noble captivity expanded across the decades of the Hundred Years' War, it became increasingly clear that what governed the fate of captured knights was not a single unified rule, but a layered network of economic expectations, political calculations, and social obligations that varied depending on who held power at any given moment. In many regions of England and France, the concept of noble ransom evolved into a structured form of obligation, where the release of a captive knight was treated as a transaction bound by reputation and enforceable through honor networks that stretched across families and allied houses. Within this framework, a knight's value was continuously assessed, not only at the moment of capture, but throughout the entire period of detention, as changing military outcomes on distant battlefields could suddenly increase or decrease the importance of an individual prisoner. This meant that captivity was not a fixed condition, but a fluid status that could shift dramatically based on external events, such as the fall of a city, the death of a commander, or the negotiation of a broader peace agreement between rival kingdoms. In practice, administrators responsible for holding noble captives maintained detailed lists that tracked correspondence, financial pledges, and intermediary contacts, forming an early administrative system that linked warfare directly to economic record-keeping. However, despite this apparent structure, the system was far from consistent, as the quality of documentation varied widely between regions and even between individual estates, resulting in fragmented records that often failed to provide a complete account of a prisoner's journey. In some instances, a knight would appear in correspondence between two noble houses, referenced in terms of ransom terms or temporary custody arrangements, only to vanish from later records without any formal notation explaining his final outcome. These gaps were not necessarily the result of secrecy, but rather the limitations of medieval administrative continuity, where wars disrupted communication networks and physical documents were frequently lost, damaged, or never updated after initial creation. Yet the effect of these gaps is significant, because they introduce uncertainty into what might otherwise appear as a fully regulated system, suggesting that the lived reality of captivity was more unstable than the surviving records imply. At the same time, the financial dimension of ransom created additional pressure points within this system, as families were often required to negotiate under conditions of urgency, balancing the cost of release against the risk of indefinite detention. This economic strain extended beyond individual households, influencing local economies in regions where land, livestock, or inherited rights were leveraged to meet ransom obligations. Over time, this created a parallel structure of dependency between captor and captive, where the continuation of a knight's survival depended not only on political goodwill, but also on the ability of external networks to mobilize resources in his name. Despite this, there remained cases where no resolution was ever recorded, leaving behind only the initial mention of capture without any subsequent documentation of release or transfer. It is within these unresolved cases that the historical narrative becomes most uncertain, as the absence of closure forces modern interpretation to confront the limits of surviving evidence and to acknowledge that within the structured world of medieval ransom systems, there still existed outcomes that were never fully recorded or fully understood. Within the evolving structure of noble captivity during the Hundred Years' War, the distinction between legal procedure and practical reality often became blurred, especially when knights of high standing were involved in prolonged detention that stretched across years of shifting political conditions. As the system matured, castles, fortified estates, and controlled residences became more than simple holding locations. They functioned as administrative centers where information, negotiation, and valuation intersected in a continuous cycle. Within these environments, the presence of a captive knight was treated as both a responsibility and an asset, requiring constant maintenance of records, supervision of movement, and coordination with external agents responsible for ransom discussions. Over time, certain holding sites developed reputations as preferred locations for noble detention, not because of uniform conditions, but because they were strategically positioned near routes of communication that allowed faster exchange of messages between opposing factions. In these places, the passage of time was carefully measured through correspondence cycles, where each exchange of letters represented a potential shift in the captive's future, whether toward release, extension of detention, or indefinite delay. However, even within these structured environments, inconsistencies persisted, particularly when regional conflicts intensified or when control over territories changed hands, leading to disruptions in record-keeping and communication continuity. In such cases, documentation could be partially preserved, copied inaccurately, or lost entirely, resulting in fragmented histories that complicate modern understanding of individual outcomes. The absence of complete records does not necessarily indicate unusual events, but it does highlight the fragile nature of administrative systems operating under prolonged warfare conditions. At the same time, the growing complexity of ransom negotiations introduced additional layers of uncertainty, as agreements could be delayed by disputes over valuation, inheritance rights, or competing claims between allied families. This meant that even when a knight's status was clearly documented at one point in time, there was no guarantee that subsequent updates would be recorded with equal precision or preserved through later administrative transitions. As a result, some captives appear only intermittently within surviving sources, creating patterns of partial visibility that suggest continuity without providing full confirmation of their eventual fate. These interruptions in the historical record are particularly significant because they reveal how dependent the entire system was on stable communication networks, which were frequently disrupted by seasonal campaigns, territorial sieges, or shifts in political control. In addition, the reliance on intermediaries such as clerks, envoys, and local administrators introduced further variability, as each layer of transmission increased the possibility of error or omission. Despite these limitations, the overall structure of noble captivity remained remarkably consistent in its underlying logic, which prioritized valuation, negotiation, and controlled release over immediate resolution. Yet within this logic, there existed unresolved cases where no final entry was ever recorded, leaving only the initial indication of capture without any corresponding conclusion. These instances continue to challenge modern interpretations as they exist at the boundary between documented history and historical absence, where the structure of medieval record-keeping meets the limitations of its own preservation. As the system of noble captivity continued to operate across the fractured landscape of the Hundred Years' War, the distinction between formal procedure and lived reality began to reveal an even deeper layer of complexity that was rarely captured in surviving records. While administrative frameworks attempted to maintain consistent tracking of captive knights, the actual experience of detention often unfolded in ways that were far more irregular, shaped by shifting local authority, inconsistent communication, and the unpredictable nature of prolonged conflict between kingdoms. In many cases, the environments in which knights were held were not static prisons in the modern sense, but adaptive spaces that changed function depending on political stability and the availability of resources, sometimes serving as temporary residences for negotiation, and at other times becoming long-term holding sites with limited oversight from central authority. Within these spaces, the passage of time was not measured by calendars alone, but by cycles of correspondence, seasonal changes in military activity, and the arrival or absence of messengers carrying updates from distant courts. This created a lived experience of captivity that was deeply dependent on external conditions, where the future of each individual was tied not only to his own status, but to events occurring across multiple regions simultaneously. As the war progressed, particularly during its later phases, the administrative burden of managing noble prisoners increased significantly, leading to greater reliance on delegated authority and local intermediaries who were responsible for maintaining order and transmitting information upward through the chain of command. However, this delegation also introduced additional points of failure, as each transfer of responsibility increased the likelihood of delays, omissions, or inconsistencies in the official record. In some instances, correspondence that confirmed the continued existence of a captive would arrive months after earlier documents had already ceased to mention him, creating overlapping layers of incomplete information that modern historians must attempt to reconcile. At the same time, the psychological dimension of captivity became more pronounced in surviving accounts, not as dramatic events, but as a gradual erosion of certainty, where the absence of clear timelines or definitive outcomes contributed to a sense of suspended existence. Knights who remained in prolonged detention often existed in a state defined by expectation without resolution, where each passing season carried the possibility of release, extension, or continued silence, depending entirely on negotiations beyond their control. This uncertainty was compounded by the fact that medieval record-keeping did not always prioritize individual continuity, instead focusing on financial agreements, political arrangements, or military outcomes, which meant that personal narratives were frequently fragmented across multiple documents. As a result, the historical footprint of many captives becomes irregular, appearing in one context and disappearing in another, without explanation or closure. These irregularities are not necessarily evidence of extraordinary events, but they do highlight the structural limitations of the systems that governed captivity during this period, particularly in times of sustained warfare, where administrative consistency was difficult to maintain. Over time, this created a historical landscape in which certainty was often replaced by inference, and where the absence of information becomes as significant as the information that survives. It is within this space between documentation and omission that the most persistent questions about noble captivity continue to exist, revealing how the reality of medieval imprisonment was shaped as much by what was recorded as by what was never fully preserved. Within the evolving framework of noble captivity during the Hundred Years' War, the final stage of analysis reveals a complex intersection between political necessity, economic pressure, and administrative fragmentation that defined how captured knights ultimately disappeared from or re-entered the historical record. As previously established, the system of ransom and detention was never a fully centralized mechanism, but rather a network of overlapping authorities operating across shifting territorial boundaries, where consistency depended heavily on stable communication and uninterrupted governance. When these conditions were present, the fate of a captive knight could be traced through successive stages of negotiation, verification, and release, each step documented in correspondence between noble households and regional administrators. However, when these conditions were disrupted by military escalation or changes in control of key regions, the continuity of this system weakened significantly, resulting in partial records that captured only fragments of an individual's status at isolated moments in time. In such circumstances, the absence of final documentation does not necessarily indicate a deliberate outcome, but rather reflects the structural limitations of medieval administrative practice under sustained pressure. At the same time, the increasing duration of the Hundred Years' War contributed to a gradual normalization of prolonged uncertainty, where extended captivity became an expected condition rather than an exceptional one, particularly for knights whose ransom value was contested or whose political affiliations complicated negotiation efforts. This normalization had a profound impact on how captivity was recorded, as chroniclers and administrators often prioritized broader strategic developments over individual continuity, leading to records that emphasize events such as battles, treaties, and territorial changes, while leaving gaps in the personal trajectories of those affected by them. Within this environment, the role of intermediaries became even more critical, as clerks, envoys, and local officials were responsible for maintaining the flow of information between opposing sides. Yet their work was frequently constrained by limited resources, travel delays, and the instability of wartime infrastructure. These constraints contributed to inconsistencies in documentation, where updates might be recorded in one region but never transmitted to another, or where correspondence confirming a knight's status might arrive long after earlier records had already ceased to mention him. As a result, the historical trace of many individuals becomes discontinuous, requiring modern interpretation to reconstruct likely outcomes based on incomplete evidence rather than definitive statements. This discontinuity is particularly evident in cases where captives appear briefly within administrative correspondence and then disappear without further reference, creating patterns that suggest unresolved transitions rather than clearly documented conclusions. While some of these cases can be partially explained by delays in record transmission or loss of documentation, others remain entirely ambiguous, highlighting the inherent instability of relying on fragmented archival systems to reconstruct long-term individual histories. Over time, this has led to a broader recognition among historians that the experience of noble captivity during this period cannot be fully understood through surviving records alone, but must also account for the structural gaps within those records that reflect the limitations of medieval governance under prolonged conflict. In this way, the absence of information becomes an essential part of the historical narrative itself, not as a mystery in isolation, but as evidence of how war, administration, and communication breakdown collectively shaped what was preserved and what was ultimately lost. As the examination of noble captivity reaches its most uncertain layer within the long span of the Hundred Years' War, the surviving patterns of documentation begin to reveal a recurring phenomenon that cannot be fully explained through standard administrative interpretation, namely the repeated absence of closure in individual cases that otherwise appear to follow established procedural pathways. Across multiple regions of England and France, records indicate that certain knights entered the recognized system of capture with their names recorded in correspondence, their status acknowledged in financial agreements, and their presence confirmed through intermediary reports. Yet these same individuals later vanish from the surviving documentary sequence without any formal notation indicating release, transfer, or continued detention. This absence does not present itself as an isolated anomaly, but rather as a structural pattern that appears intermittently across different decades of the conflict, suggesting that the underlying system, while organized in principle, was not consistently capable of maintaining complete longitudinal tracking of every individual subject to captivity. In practical terms, this meant that once a knight entered the network of detention and negotiation, his documented existence depended entirely on the continued flow of administrative communication, which was itself vulnerable to disruption from territorial instability, loss of records, and changes in local governance. When these disruptions occurred, the continuity of an individual's recorded status could break entirely, leaving only partial references that failed to resolve into a final outcome. Over time, these incomplete sequences created a category of historical uncertainty that exists not as a singular mystery, but as a repeated condition within the broader system of medieval record-keeping. In some cases, later documents reference earlier captives indirectly, suggesting that their cases may have been resolved through private agreements or unrecorded exchanges, while in other instances, no subsequent reference appears at all, leaving their trajectory entirely open to interpretation. This inconsistency reflects not only the limitations of archival preservation, but also the prioritization of administrative resources during wartime, where attention was often directed toward active negotiations and ongoing military developments, rather than the long-term tracking of every individual case. As a result, the historical record privileges moments of transaction over continuity of identity, creating a fragmented narrative in which certain lives are documented in detail for brief periods and then fade into absence without explanation. This pattern becomes especially significant when viewed across the entire duration of the Hundred Years' War, as the accumulation of such gaps suggests a systemic limitation rather than isolated oversight. The absence of resolution in these cases does not necessarily imply extraordinary circumstances, but it does highlight the fragility of relying on decentralized record systems under prolonged conditions of conflict. Furthermore, it demonstrates how historical knowledge is shaped not only by what was recorded, but also by what was never consistently maintained or preserved through successive administrative transitions. In this sense, the unresolved trajectories of certain captives serve as indicators of the broader instability within the system itself, revealing how even highly structured frameworks of ransom and detention could produce outcomes that remain undocumented. Ultimately, these patterns underscore the reality that within the formalized world of medieval noble captivity, the boundary between recorded history and historical absence was not fixed, but continuously shaped by the limitations of communication, preservation, and institutional continuity. Across the long and fragmented history of noble captivity during the Hundred Years' War, the final synthesis of surviving evidence does not lead to a single clear conclusion, but instead reveals a structured system that repeatedly produced outcomes beyond its own capacity to fully record. What emerges from the accumulated records, correspondence, and administrative fragments is not a complete ledger of every knight who entered captivity, but rather a partial map of transitions, interruptions, and unresolved endpoints that define the limits of medieval documentation itself. Within this system, a captured knight was expected to move through identifiable stages, from battlefield capture to verified identification, followed by negotiated valuation, and ultimately release or formal transfer. Yet the historical record demonstrates that this sequence was not always completed in a traceable way. In certain cases, documentation confirms the beginning of this process with precision, recording names, affiliations, and initial conditions of detention, but then fails to provide any subsequent entries that would indicate the final outcome. This absence is not concentrated in a single region or moment in time, but appears across different phases of the conflict, suggesting that the breakdown of continuity was not incidental but systemic under the pressures of prolonged warfare. As communication networks stretched across contested territories, and as political control shifted repeatedly between opposing forces, the ability to maintain consistent records diminished, leaving behind isolated references that cannot always be connected into a complete narrative. Over time, this created a historical environment in which the fate of certain individuals became detached from the administrative systems that initially recorded their existence, resulting in a category of unresolved cases that exist only as partial traces within surviving archives. These traces are often sufficient to confirm that a knight entered the system of captivity, but insufficient to determine how or when his status was ultimately resolved, if at all. Modern analysis of these patterns suggests that the structure of medieval noble captivity, while highly organized in principle, was dependent on fragile mechanisms of record preservation and communication continuity that were vulnerable to disruption at every stage. When these mechanisms failed, the system did not always generate a corrective record, leaving gaps that persist into the present as unanswered historical absences. It is within these absences that the most persistent uncertainty remains. Not because the events themselves were necessarily extraordinary, but because the framework designed to record them was never fully capable of preserving every transition from beginning to end. As a result, the final understanding of noble captivity during this period is defined as much by what is missing as by what survives, creating a historical landscape where resolution is often absent and where the final fate of certain individuals remains permanently outside the reach of documentation, suspended in a silence that no surviving record can fully explain.